Another ingredient, not before mentioned, also came into operation in my need to provide a great function for Strider Aragorn, what I might call my Atlantis haunting. This legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I awake gasping out of deep water. I used to draw it or write bad poems about it. When C.S. Lewis and I tossed up, and he was to write on space travel, and I on time travel, I began an abortive book of time travel, of which the end was to be the presence of my hero in the drowning of Atlantis. This was to be called Numenor, the land in the west. The thread was to be the occurrence time and again in human families, like Durin among the dwarves, of a father and son called by names that could be interpreted as Bliss-friend and Elf-friend. These no longer understood or found in the end to refer to the Atlantid Numenorian situation and mean one loyal to the Valar, content with the bliss and prosperity within the limits prescribed, and one loyal to friendship with the High Elves. It started with the father-son affinity between Edwin and Elwin of the present, and was supposed to go back into legendary time by way of an Eadwin and an Elfwin of circa AD 918, and Audun and Albuin of Lombardic legend, and so the traditions of the North Sea concerning the coming of corn, and culture heroes, ancestors of kingly lines in boats, and their departure in funeral ships. One such sheaf, or shield sheafing, can actually be made out as one of the remote ancestors of our present queen. In my tale, we were to come at last to Amandil and Elendil, leaders of the loyal party in Numenor, when it fell under the domination of Sauron. Elendil, Elf-friend, was the founder of the exiled kingdoms in Arnor and Gondor. But I found my real interest was only in the upper end, the Akalabeth or Atalantiae, downfall in Númenorian and Kenya. So I brought all the stuff I'd written on the originally unrelated legends of Numenor into relation with the main mythology. Well, there you are. I hope it does not bore you. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Well, I hope it does not bore you. We are still in the throat clearing. We are still... Well, you did say that you wanted to understand world building, and we want to understand Tolkien's world building, and we want to understand where all the stories came from. Well, so did many of his readers, as we're learning. This is a certain mysterious Christopher Bretherton, to whom Tolkien wrote in July 1964, so about a decade after The Lord of the Rings had come out. And as far as I can see, either in Humphrey Carpenter's biography or based on the wilds of the internet, nobody seems to know who this was, or at least nobody seems to have referenced Bretherton. And yet, Tolkien seems to be quite familiar with him. Dear Bretherton, he addresses him, which makes it sound to me like he's writing to a schoolmate or a fellow academic in the Oxford style, if you address your intimates with their last name. It's a little hard to tell. It seems like there had been an exchange of letters and Tolkien starting in the middle, but what Tolkien does in this letter is very interesting. A initial early reviewer of Carpenter's editions of the letters described this letter, it's 257, as really an interior history of Tolkien's reading and imagination. So we have Tolkien desperate I mean, desperate, that sounds a little bit strong, but Tolkien did keep writing to people who wrote to him and who kept asking him, where did the stories come from? Where did the stories come from? How did you do it? How did you do it? Well, because we are interested in this exercise of subcreation, we want to know how Tolkien did it. And here's one of the great letters that suggests some of the process. Now, it starts kind of, as I've said, it's sort of in the middle, and apologizes. We're also learning that Tolkien apologizes a lot, and I think this episode is going to be kind of apologetic, and the toss-up, and what is he doing, and da-da-da. I am wanting to get so many elements of Tolkien's creativity on stage for you, and in each of these episodes that we're working through, I realize, and yet there's another one, yet there's another one, yet there's another one. They are all connected for Tolkien. We've talked about subcreation, we've talked about history, we've talked about language, we've talked about Tom Bombadil as a storyteller, we've talked about dragons, and yet we're still only, to a certain extent, at the beginning. That one of the things that, as everyone says, when you're reading The Lord of the Rings, you feel like there's enormous depth behind what goes on in that narrative, and this is in this letter we're learning yet more how much depth there was even before Tolkien started trying to write The Lord of the Rings, right? But one of the tidbits in this letter is at the very beginning, where he's a kind of apologizing, not apologizing. Receiving an answer on July 14th to a letter only posted on the 10th was prompt work, even for normal postal conditions. I do not regard typing as a discourtesy. Anyway, I usually type, since my hand tends to start fair and rapidly fall away into picturesque inscrutability. Now, that is probably a little bit of a surprise, right? Wait, Tolkien typed? I mean, what you'll have seen of his manuscripts are always his trying to do all the great calligraphy and write in the Fëanorian script and, create pages out of the manuscripts that he's imagining his own characters creating. And yet here he is admitting that he typed, right? Also, he says, I like typewriters. And my dream is of suddenly finding myself rich enough to have an electric typewriter built to my specifications to type the Fëanorian script. It's rather sad that he died when he did and didn't live, as long as his son Christopher, to find out that yes, now we can all type in the Fëanorian script if we have the right font on our word processor. I typed out The Hobbit and the whole of The Lord of the Rings twice, and several sections many times. On my bed in an attic of Manor Road, in the dark days between the loss of my large house in North Oxford, which I could no longer afford, and my brief elevation to the dignity of an old college house in Holywell. So, just as if you have the usual trope of Tolkien disliked machines, well, he dreamed of a typewriter that could type the Fëanorian script for him. And now having explained his mechanics, he's going to answer what seems to have been Bretherton's question about, well, how did you do it? What did you write about? First, he gives you yet more details about his living conditions, that, there was lots of traffic along the road, and now that it's a car park, what the actual inhabitants do, all the radio, telly, dogs, scooters, buzz bikes, and cars of all sizes, but the smallest can do to produce noise from the early morning to about 2 a.m. In addition, in a house 3 doors away dwells a member of a group of young men who are evidently aiming to turn themselves into a Beatle group. This is 1964. So he's got some musicians along the road. He's got traffic and so forth. Okay, now he says, okay, fine, I'll answer your question. With regards to your question, not easy to answer with anything shorter than an autobiography, which, of course, interestingly, Tolkien never actually wrote. He just wrote all these letters of people asking him, how did you do it? How did you do it? How did you do it? I began the construction of languages in early boyhood. So again, he always casts back to these beginnings, right? Last time we talked about his casting back to the beginnings of desiring dragons. Well, now he's trying yet again, and I suppose it is interesting here that these questions that people are asking about how did you do it, typically end up with him giving some kind of autobiography. That the stories were very, very personal to him. They're very intimate, and yet, thus prompting the desire to figure out which of the characters is him, right? And in truth, always my dictum is they're all him, right? That all of Tolkien's characters are some reflection of something that he is wrestling with, working out, and that includes the women, right? So if you're trying to imagine where is his autobiography, he wrote it his whole life, right? But he keeps trying to encapsulate it, and here he says, I began in early boyhood, so here I am, back at the beginning. I am primarily a scientific philologist. So he considers himself working, as we've talked about, within the scientific study of language. And it is interesting that is, this is a decade after the Lord of the Rings has come out, and he still won't say, oh, well, I've clearly been more successful as a novelist, and that's what I really am. No, I'm a scientific philologist. My interests were and remain largely scientific. That does matter, right? That he doesn't think what he's doing is primarily, well, it's interesting. It's like he wants to be a sub-creator, but he also wants to be scientific, whatever that means for him. But I was also interested in traditional tales, especially those concerning dragons, as we saw last time, and writing, not reading, verse and metrical devices, right? So we have scientific philology, dragons, which he considers parts of traditional tales, and writing verse and metrical devices. As we explore deeper and deeper into his legendarium, we're going to have to read some more poems, right? And to understand why his scientific study of languages brought him to the study of structured compositions. These things began to flow together when I was an undergraduate, to the despair of my tutors and near wrecking of my career. For when officially engaged on classics, I made the acquaintance of languages not usually studied by the modern English. So they didn't fit in the program that he was supposed to be doing, each with a powerfully individual phonetic aesthetic: Welsh, Finnish, and the remnants of 4th century Gothic. Finnish also provided a glimpse of an entirely different mythological world. Okay, so we have some more specific pieces in addition to dragons, and the specific languages that he was attracted to, the phonemes, the phonetic understanding of those languages. And he's going to give us a brief history of what he did with all of that, right? The germ of my attempt to write legends of my own to fit my private languages was the tragic tale of the hapless Kullervo in the Finnish Kalevala. It remains a major matter in the legends of the First Age, which I hope to publish as the Silmarillion, though as the Children of Hurin, it is entirely changed except in the tragic ending. The second point was the writing out of my head, so saying the Children of Hurin is modeled on the Kullervo story, but this next story is one that he's made up, right? So out of my head, of the fall of Gondolin, the story of Idril and Erindil during sick leave from the army in 1917. So very early, right? That this is he's writing these stories down right after he's sent home from the trenches, basically. And by the original version of the Tale of Luthien, to Nuviel and Baron later in the same year. That was founded on a small wood with a great undergrowth of hemlock. No doubt many other plants were also there, near Roos in Holderness, where I was for a while on the Humber garrison. He's not telling you more details that we'll talk about when we talk about Baron and Luthien, but it's interesting there that he points to the plants. It's like he's inspired. The story comes out of the landscape, right? I carried on with this construction after escaping from the army. During a short time in Oxford, employed on the staff of the then still incomplete Great Dictionary, and then when I went to the University of Leeds, 1920 to 1926. So his first job after he recovers from being wounded in the trenches is to work on the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, and he's there for about a year, 1919 to 1920, and it's then that he says he first wrote his great creation story. In O, he says, I wrote a cosmogonical myth, the music of the Aenir, defining the relationship of the One, the transcendental creator, to the Valar, the powers, the angelical first created, and their part in ordering and carrying out the primeval design. Right? So he's got the Silmarillion's not published until after he's dead, right? Then Christopher starts editing all the papers, but he's been working on these stories since the very beginning, and that he's working in college, what we as an undergraduate, on his first layers of stories, and he starts writing down these myths, or at least the ones that he's pointing to. There's lots of others, the Book of Lost Tales and the Book of Lost Tales too. These are some of the earliest ones from those years. Yes, and they're different editions. Layers of my own reading practice. And so we already have in, before 1920, the first versions of the music of the Aenir. It was also told how it came about that Eru, the One, made an addition to the design, introducing the themes of the Eruhin, the children of God, the firstborn, elves, and the successors, men, whom the Valar were forbidden to try and dominate by fear or force. At that time, I also began to invent alphabets, the one that he wanted the typewriter for. In Leeds, I began to try and deal with this matter in high and serious style and wrote much of it in verse. Right, so his earliest storytelling is in poetry, not in prose. The first version of the Song of Strider concerning Luthien, now included in 1204, originally appeared in the Leeds University magazine, but the whole tale, as sketched by Aragorn, was written in a poem of great length, as far as he's giving references in The Lord of the Rings, so volume 1, 206, line 17, her father, right? So his own sense of his compositional practice is, I wrote all of these various stories, and they each have slightly different origins. This one is in the Hemlock. This one is in my desire for I'm modeling myself on the previous mythologies. This one came out of my own head. Here I'm writing alphabets. I returned to Oxford in January 1926, and now jump, right? And by the time The Hobbit appeared in 1937, this matter of elder days was in coherent form. The Hobbit was not intended to have anything to do with it. I had the habit, while my children were still young, of inventing and telling orally, sometimes of writing down, children's stories for their private amusement, according to the notions I then had, and many still have, of what these should be like in style and attitude. We've talked about that, right? The sort of wrestling that Tolkien does with, whether fairy stories fit in the concept children's stories, and how his own compositional practice included writing stories like The Hobbit for his children, and talking about the way hobbits talk to dragons in that sort of wink wink way. But he's trying to figure out what all of those stories that he'd been writing before he had children do in respect to this legendarium that he's creating. I'm sure all of you know this, but Luthien is modeled on his wife, or on his love for his wife, and so he's writing Beren and Luthien before around the time they conceived their first child, Michael. And he's saying The Hobbit was intended to be one of these other stories, these children's stories, but he's wrestling with it, right? It had no necessary connection with the mythology, but naturally became attracted toward this dominant construction in my mind, causing the tale to become larger and more heroic as it proceeded. Even so, it could really stand quite apart, except for the references, unnecessary though they give an impression of historical depth, to the fall of Gondolin, the branches of the Elfkin, and the quarrel of King Thingol, Luthien's father, with the dwarves, right? So he's got these other stories already written, and as he's working on The Hobbit, he's like picking up references and sticking them in, and that, of course, if The Hobbit's the only one you've read, or if The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are the only ones you've read, or if you've only seen the movies, you'll say, well, where do he keeps referring to these other stories? Well, we're going to be reading a lot of them. And you start seeing that impression of depth is not just in the fact that he kind of references this stuff, but it's because they did really exist, and so there's an honesty in that references. Okay, so then he's talking about the Hobbits published. The Hobbit saw the light, made my connection without Unwin by an accident. A and U. It was not known except to my children and my friend C.S. Lewis, but I lent it to the Mother Superior of Cherwell Edge to amuse her while covering from the flu, and so forth. It came to notice, and this is, we know the publication of The Hobbit, and then they asked for a sequel. Well, what is he going to use for the sequel? Where is he going to come up with the next story? Well, they wanted a sequel, but I wanted heroic legends and high romance. And now we have his indication of, okay, there's some of these other stories, but there's also sort of story elements that he needed to figure out what to do with, right? The magic ring was the one obvious thing in The Hobbit that could be connected with my mythology, right? So the ring is going to be that first thread that he's going to try to play out and figure out how they can fit in. I then linked it with the originally quite casual reference to the necromancer, whose function was hardly more than to provide a reason for Gandalf going away and leaving Bilbo and the dwarves to fend for themselves, which was necessary for the tale. Again, this is going to happen again and again, but you'll find out, as a writer, you often throw out things that have one function, and then they come later to seem to have a more concrete function, and then do you decide that function was always there in the first place? Writing as a historian, you're often struggling with this problem. It's like, are these things really part of the same story, or am I just seeing that now and I've invented this relationship? Where's the causality in this kind of creative work, but also in this kind of narrative construction? From The Hobbit also derived the matter of the dwarves, Durin and their prime ancestor, and Moria, and Elrond. The passage in chapter 3 relating him to the half-elven of the mythology was a fortunate accident, due to the difficulty of constantly inventing good names for new characters. I gave him the name Elrond casually, but as this came from the mythology, Elros and Elrond, the two sons of Arendelle, I made him half-elven. Only in The Lord of the Rings was he identified with the son of Arendelle, and so the great-grandson of Luthien and Beren, a great power and a ring holder. Okay, so now he's saying, I had this name, I stuck it in the story, and then it had to make sense, and so I figured out that he was half-elven. And now we get to the passage that we opened with today, the reason for Strider Aragorn. That's what I'd like to talk in depth with you about for the remainder of this episode, and watch the way in which Tolkien has layered in all of these different problems for himself, right? So we've already got the usual interminable professorial exposition of this kind of element and that kind of element and this kind of element, and somehow for him all of the problems come sort of into this magnificent focus with figuring out who Aragorn was, Strider Aragorn. Some of you learned in the lore of the composition of The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, will remember that he invents Strider before he knows who he is, and in fact he even names the character before he knows that it's a man. He says it's Trotter. Strider is everything's in the nomenclature, right? If it's Trotter, he's just in a sort of another hobbit, and are they going to find a wise hobbit that's going to lead them along and Bree? Oh no, that's a silly name. We're going to call him Strider. But he's gotten to the point where he's wrestling with the puzzles that he's creating by giving the hobbits from the Shire people to meet, and I still don't know who it is, right? And the explanation that he gives to Bretherton is famous, among other reasons, because there's a reference to C.S. Lewis's and his conversations about how do you create effective stories, and that same story is referenced in a later letter. This is letter 294. He's commenting on an interview, some questions that they asked him in an interview, and they seem to have asked him, it's like, why did you write this, right? They have him as quoted as saying, I'm always looking for something I can't find, something like what I wrote myself. There's nothing like being vain, is there? It's so interesting, the way he's, on the one hand, obviously very proud of his craft and his skill and the labor that he's put into all of these creations, and then self-effacing. Is it modesty? Is it terror of being misunderstood? Is it, decades of being a professor and you have to like keep your class engaged and play lots of status interactions? You are trying to draw people in and not overbear. Tolkien had sort of mixed reviews as a lecturer or as a teacher, but it's saying, I wanted to write something that was mine and that I liked, and records the other instance of this this conversation that he and Lewis had. He says, okay, in answer to that quote that they were referencing for him, an apology for seeming to speak out of vanity. Actually, this arose in humility, my own and Lewis's, the humility of amateurs in a world of great writers. L said to me one day, Tollers, there is too little of what we really like in stories. I am afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves. This is interesting because now everybody's trying to write Tolkien, right? Vox talks regularly about being honored to be compared with Tolkien, and I'm thinking just today about the blog post that he put up when he published my Tom Bombadil episode, and saying I never liked Mordor, called it Bordor, and I tried to fix it and throw in the bones. What Tolkien and Lewis were saying is nobody wrote the kind of stories that we like. How do we write something that nobody's writing? To think about that. And now when everybody's trying to write yet more Tolkien didn't feel like there was anybody writing his stories. There was nobody writing the kinds of stories he liked. And he and Lewis were saying this to each other and saying, well, what shall we write? And I'd say, that is a very interesting, what kind of stories were they aiming at? What did it mean for Tolkien and Lewis to say nobody else is writing what we like reading? I often, in my own reading, are saying, is there nobody else? There's Lewis and Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers, and Terry Pratchett's kind of over there on the side, but he's a little different. I do agree with Box on Susan Cooper. I've reread those many times. And then you run out, right? And no, I haven't reread Harry Potter in ages, and I don't count his Dark Materials for obvious theological reasons, I hope. To keep returning to what Lewis and Tolkien wrote and say, why isn't anybody writing what we like reading? Even though now they've in fact generated an entire subgenre of we call fantasy. What did it mean? What were they trying for? Well, Tolkien says, we agreed that he should try space travel and I should try time travel. Okay, so I thought they were writing fairy stories or Christian allegory, or wait, that their original discussion was Lewis would write space travel and Tolkien would try time travel, right? That's not what we were supposed to be worrying about. We're supposed to be writing mythology or fairy story. And here Tolkien is telling us, no, that the origin of these stories was in this toss-up. And, whether they actually tossed a coin or just said, okay, you try space, I'll try time. And remember that Tolkien earlier said he wanted to be scientific. We're going to unpack a lot of this over the next several episodes. But that they're thinking in terms of space and time. And Lewis then famously goes on to write the Space Trilogy, which Tolkien acknowledges. Lewis's result is well known. My effort, after a few promising chapters, ran dry. It was too long a way round to what I really wanted to make, a new version of the Atlantis legend. The final scene survives as the downfall of Numenor. So now we find out that Aragorn, as a character in Tolkien's inventive process, came out of a desire to write an Atlantis legend, which in fact he wanted linked to the present by some kind of mechanism of time travel. I mean, is he writing science fiction, or is he writing what is it? What category of fiction is Tolkien actually trying to? He's not thinking of inventing a genre. He's thinking of writing the kinds of stories he and Lewis like reading, and his version of it is to make some kind of travel into the past, right? So the Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is a history. This attracted Lewis greatly, as Hurd read, and reference to it occurs in several places in his works, The Last of the Wine and his poems. We neither of us expected much success as amateurs, and actually Lewis had some difficulty in getting Out of the Silent Planet published. And after all that has happened since, the most lasting pleasure and reward for both of us has been that we provided one another with stories to hear or read that we really liked, in large parts. Naturally, neither of us liked all that we found in the other's fiction. There's a kind of sad reference at the end of the letter to Brotherton, saying, yes, CSL was my closest friend from about 1927 to 1940 and remained very dear to me. 1940 is very interesting, very soon after The Hobbit came out. His death was a grievous blow, but in fact we saw less and less of one another after he came under the dominant influence of Charles Williams, and still less after his very strange marriage. ... I read Pilgrim's Regress in manuscript. I have never been able to enjoy Pickwick. I now find The Lord of the Rings good in parts. I must now end with deep apologies for my garrulity. I hope, however, that it is interesting in parts. Yours sincerely, Ronald Tolkien. Let's go back to that story that never got published. The time travel story that gave Tolkien the Numenor story, that gave him Aragorn's ancestry, that gave him the Men of Westerness, and that gave him, therefore, the reason that Aragorn ultimately is properly the king to return. But that's lots and lots to unpack. Let's just go back to this question: why, how are you going to do time travel? Why would you do time travel? What does he mean by time travel? And I suppose main question for us today is, how would it change our sense of what Tolkien accomplished if he had actually been able to publish this as the sequel to The Lord of the Rings? Albuin! There was no answer. There was no one in the playroom. Albuin! Oswin Errol stood at the door and called into the small high garden at the back of his house. At length a young voice answered, sounding distant and like the answer of someone asleep or just awakened. Yes? Where are you? Here. Where is here? Here, up on the wall, Father. Oswin sprang down the steps from the door into the garden and walked along the flower-bordered path. It led after a turn to a low stone wall screened from the house by a hedge. Beyond the stone wall there was a brief space of turf and then a cliff edge, beyond which outstretched and now shimmering in a calm evening the western sea. Upon the wall Oswin found his son, a boy about 12 years old, lying gazing out to sea with his chin in his hands. So there you are, he said. You take a deal of calling, didn't you hear me? Not before the time when I answered, said Albuin. Well, you must be deaf or dreaming, said his father. Dreaming, it looks like. It is getting very near bedtime. So if you want any story tonight, we shall have to begin at once. I'm sorry, Father, but I was thinking. What about? Oh, lots of things mixed up. The sea and the world and Albuin. Albuin? Yes, I wondered why Albuin. Why am I called Albuin? They often ask me why Albuin at school, and they call me Allbone, but I'm not. Am I? You look rather bony, boy, but you are not all bone. I am glad to say. I am afraid I called you Alboin, and that is why you are called it. I'm sorry, I never meant it to be a nuisance to you. But it is a real name, isn't it? Said Alboin eagerly. I mean, it means something, and men have been called it. It isn't just invented. Of course not. It's just as real and just as good as Oswin. And it belongs to the same family, you might say. But no one ever bothered me about Oswin, though I often used to get called Oswald by mistake. I remember how it used to annoy me, though I can't think why. I was rather particular about my name. They remained talking on the wall overlooking the sea and did not go back into the garden or the house until bedtime. Their talk, as often happened, drifted into storytelling, and Oswin told his son the tale of Alban, son of Audun, the Lombard king, and of the great battle of the Lombards and the Gepids, remembered as terrible even in the grim 6th century, and of the kings Therisund and Cunimund, and of Rosamunda. Not a good story for near bedtime, he said, ending suddenly with Albin's drinking from the jeweled skull of Cunimund. I don't like that Alban much, said the boy. I like the Gepids better, and King Therisund. I wish they had won. Why didn't you call me Therisund or Therismod? Well, really, Mother had meant to call you Rosamund, only you turned up a boy. And she didn't live to help me choose another name, you know. So I took one out of that story because it seemed to fit. I mean, the name doesn't belong only to that story, it is much older. Would you have rather been called Elf-friend? For that's what the name means. No, said Alban doubtfully. I like names to mean something, but not to say something. Well, I might have called you Alfwina, of course. That is the Old English form of it. I might have called you that, not only after Alfwina of Italy, but also after all of the elf friends of old, after Alfwina, King Alfred's grandson, who fell in the great victory in 937, and Alfwina, who fell in the famous defeat at Malden, and many other Englishmen and Northerners in the long line of elf friends. But I gave you a Latinized form. I think that is best. The old days of the North are gone beyond recall, except insofar as they have been worked into the shape of things as we know it, into Christendom. So I took Alban, for it is not Latin and not Northern, and that is the way of most names in the West, and also of the men that bear them. I might have chosen Albinus, for that is what they sometimes turn the name into, and it wouldn't have reminded your friends of bones. But it is too Latin and means something in Latin, and you are not white or fair, boy, but dark. So Alban you are. And that is all there is to it, except bed. And they went in. So that's the first section in this, these excerpts, and Christopher published them as The Lost Road, these first chapters, and this is chapter 1, as it were, young Alban. Think of all the anchors that Tolkien has put in here. He has Alban looking out at the sea, right? So he has that theme of looking to the west, looking across the sea. That's going to be constantly his anchor. That the dream that he is saying this all comes out of is about a great wave that comes up, and if it's Atlantis story, it's going to be the drowning, right? So it's the focus is on looking out at the sea. It's a father and son, and in the story it's set up so that there's no mother, that she's died giving birth to Alban. And Oswin, whose name, which they don't talk about, means God friend, is talking to now his son, Elf friend. And Alban wants his name to mean something, right? He doesn't want it to be made up. He doesn't want it to be invented. He wants it to have a reality in story, in previous, other people. He's saying men have been called it. Like, I want to be related to my name. I want other people to have had this name, and I want the name itself to be anchored not just in semantics, in its meaning, but in this transmission of, inheritance. His father, son, father, son, father, son. He wants a genealogical reference for it. Although what Oswin tells him is, no, I chose it for you because it came out of this story. But Tolkien is trying to figure out the mechanism to get him back in time, right? And it's going to be triggered, you find out, by this desire to have this alternating pairs of father son father son father son, all the way back to Amandil and Elendil in Numenor, and it will be each time over and over again. In fact, interestingly, not God-friend and Elf-friend, but Bliss-friend and Elf-friend, because Albuin is going to have a son, Auduin, and we have Alfwine and I'm sorry, I blanked on the name. It's embarrassing because I'm not as much of a philologist as Eadwin. Eadwine and Elfwine are going to be the Bliss-friend and Elf-friend, and in each of, and it keeps going back, right? Edwin and Elwyn of the present, Eadwine and Elfwine of circa 918, Audun and Albuin of Lombardic legend, through Sheafing, through to Amandil and Elendil, and the sort of mechanism, and actually we're going to get to talk a lot about names and language some more when we talk about the Notion Club papers, where Tolkien's still struggling with all of this, right? But they're trying to find a way that you could in fact travel in time, and how would you make that real to the reader? And the first is this desire that Alban has of the name being real, and then his father introducing him to these stories. So you're going to get a narration, a framing of the story, and belong in it because your name is already there. I'm Rachel, right? So I belong in that story in the Old Testament as the wife of Jacob, that you are yourself tied to the past by the reality of the name that you carry. It's very not nominalist, and whether or not there's, it's interesting as Tolkien played with this in the storytelling, whether or not having these names means that there is a sort of elf-friend reality that everyone named that participates in. He never got that far, but he sort of, anti-nominalist is the strongest thing I can come up with right now. He does not want these names just to be sounds, the flavors and so forth that we're talking about. He wants them to have some purchase on time, and yet there's more. So they went in, but Alban looked out of his window before getting into bed, and he could see the sea beyond the edge of the cliff. It was a late sunset, for it was summer. The sun sank slowly to the sea and dipped red beyond the horizon. The light and color faded quickly from the water. A chilly wind came up out of the west, and over the sunset rim, great dark clouds sailed up, stretching huge wings southward and northward, threatening the land. They look like the eagles of the Lord of the West coming upon Numenor, Alban said aloud, and he wondered why. Though it did not seem very strange to them, in those days he often made up names. Looking on a familiar hill, he would see it suddenly standing in some other time and story. The green shoulders of Amon Arab, he would say. The waves are loud upon the shores of Beleriand, he said one day, when storm was piling water at the foot of the cliff below the house. Some of these names were really made up to please himself with their sound, or so he thought, but others seemed real, as if they had not been spoken first by him. So it was with Numenor. I like that, he said to himself. I could think of a long story about the land of Numenor. But as he lay in bed, he found that the story would not be thought. And soon he forgot the name, and other thoughts crowded in, partly due to his father's words and partly to his own daydreams before. Dark Albuin, and here they're talking it in terms of hair color, right? But that's typical of medieval stories, that people are described as white or dark based on their hair, not their skin. It's a difference. Dark Albuin, he thought, I wonder if there's any Latin in me. Not much, I think. I love the western shores and the real sea. It is quite different from the Mediterranean, even in stories. I wish there were no other side to it. There were dark-haired there were dark-haired people who were not Latins. Are the Portuguese Latins? What is Latin? I wonder what kind of people lived in Portugal and Spain and Ireland and Britain in old days, very old days, before the Romans or the Carthaginians, before anybody else. I wonder what the man thought who was the first to see the Western Sea. Then he fell asleep and dreamed. But when he woke, the dream slipped beyond recall and left no tale or picture behind, only the feeling that these had brought, the sort of feeling Albin connected with long, strange names. And he got up, and summer slipped by, and he went to school and went on learning Latin. Okay, so Tolkien's giving us a lot of hints in his own storytelling process, and he's going to develop these problems more in the next story. We'll talk about the Notion Club Papers, which he is also trying to wrestle with this problem. But point is, like, Albin's worrying about the reality of names, and then he's dreaming, and the names and the dreams come together for him. But he's also learning his languages, and you realize, of course, that Tolkien is writing his own sort of imaginative autobiography here by talking about Albin's study of languages and the way it's connected with his naming hills and then wanting to attach stories to them. So he learned Latin, and he also learned Greek. And later, when he was about 15, he began to learn other languages, especially those of the North: Old English, Norse, Welsh, Irish. This was not much encouraged, even by his father, who was a historian. Latin and Greek, it seemed to be thought, were enough for anybody, and quite old-fashioned enough. When there were so many successful modern languages spoken by millions of people, not to mention math and all the sciences, so there's persistently an anxiety for Tolkien and whether or not it's worth his time learning other languages, although he always felt like wanting to learn those other languages was a sort of guilty pleasure, as opposed to the proper study that you're supposed to be doing in classics and modern languages. But Albin liked the flavor of the older northern languages quite as much as he liked some of the things written in them. He got to know a bit about linguistic history, of course. He found that you rather had it thrust on you anyway by the grammar writers of unclassical languages. Not that he objected. Sound changes were a hobby of his at the age when other boys were learning about the insides of motor cars. But although he had some idea of what were supposed to be the relationships of European languages, it did not seem to him quite all the story. The languages he liked had a definite flavor, and to some extent a similar flavor which they shared. It seemed to, in some way, related to the atmosphere of the legend and myth told in the languages. We've talked about that before, and this will recur for Tolkien, that the languages have flavors, the flavors have this atmosphere, and the stories go with that taste and setting. Atmosphere is the best word for it. And there's both Tolkien and Lewis were very interested in this sense of, I never can think of a better word than atmosphere. Lewis in the Space Trilogy, as Michael Ward has shown, is very sensitive to the way in which each of the planets have a particular sort of character. I mean, atmosphere, in the sense that when he has Ransom on Mars, there's a Mars flavor atmosphere. When he has Ransom on Venus, there's a Venus flavor atmosphere. And the Silent Planet, the problem is that Earth is muffled, right? That nobody can hear it outside in the great music of the spheres. So this sense of atmosphere clearly is one of those things that Tolkien and Lewis must have wrestled over. How do you create that story feeling, place, taste, appreciation? I'm just going to have to revert to atmosphere. It's that they're also trying to figure out how this aesthetic ramifies out through the different perceptions that we have. That's making it too scientific. They don't really talk about it in those terms. And then there's a conversation. One day when Albin was nearly 18, he was sitting in the study with his father. It was autumn and the end of summer holidays, spent mostly in the open. Fires were coming back. It was the time in all the year when book lore is most attractive to those who really like it at all. They were talking language. For Errol encouraged his boy to talk about anything he was interested in, although secretly he'd been wondering for some time whether northern languages and legends were not taking up more time and energy than their practical value in a hard world justified. But I had better know what's going on as far as any father can, he thought. He'll go on anyway, if he really has a bent, and it better not be bent inwards. Alban was trying to explain his feeling about language atmosphere. You get echoes coming through, you know, he said, in odd words here and there, often very common words in their own language, but quite unexplained by the etymology, and in the general shape and sound of all the words somehow, as if something was peeping through from the deep under the surface. Of course, I am not a philologist, said his father, but I never could see that there was much evidence in favor of ascribing language changes to a substratum, though I suppose underlying ingredients do have an influence, though it is not easy to define, on the final mixture in the case of peoples taken as a whole, different national talents and temperaments, and that sort of thing. But races and cultures are different from languages. Yes, said Alban, but very mixed up, all three together. And after all, language goes back by a continuous tradition into the past, just as much as the other two. I often think that if you knew the living faces of any man's ancestors a long way back, you might find some queer things. You might find that he got his nose quite clearly from, say, his mother's great-grandfather, and yet that something about his nose, its expression, or its set, or whatever you might like to call it, really came down from much further back, from, say, his father's great-great-great-grandfather or greater. Anyway, I like to go back, and not with race only, or culture only, or language, but with all three. I wish I could go back with the three that are mixed in us, Father, just the plain Errols, with the little house in Cornwall in the summer. I wonder what one would see. Depends on how far you went back, said the elder Errol. If you went back beyond the ice ages, I imagine you would find nothing in these parts, or at any rate a pretty beastly and uncomely race, and tooth and nail culture, and a disgusting language with no echoes for you unless those of food noises. Would you? Said Alban. I wonder. Anyway, you can't go back, said his father, except within the limits prescribed to us mortals. You can go back in a sense by honest study, long and patient work. You had better go in for archaeology as well as philology. They ought to go well enough together, though they aren't joined very often. Good idea, said Alban. But you remember long ago you said I was not all bone. Well, I want some mythology as well. I want myths, not only bones and stones. Well, you can't have 'em. You can have 'em. Take the whole lot on, said his father, laughing. But in the meanwhile, you have a smaller job on hand. Your Latin needs improving, or so I am told, for school purposes, and scholarships are useful in lots of ways, especially for folk like you and me. You go in for antiquated subjects. Your first shot is this winter, remember. I wish Latin prose was not so important, said Alban. I am really much better at verses. Don't go putting any bits of your Arisaean or Elf Latin, or whatever you call it, into your verses at Oxford. It might scan, but it wouldn't pass. Of course not, said the boy, blushing. The matter was too private, even for private jokes. And don't go babbling about Arisaean outside the partnership, he begged, or I shall wish I had kept it quiet. Well, you did pretty well. I don't suppose I should ever have heard about it if you hadn't left your notebooks in my study. Even so, I don't know much about it. But, my dear lad, I shouldn't dream of blabbing even if I did. Only don't waste too much time on it. I'm afraid I'm anxious about that scholarship, not only from the highest motives. Cash is not too abundant. Oh, I haven't thought of anything of that sort for a long while, at least. Hardly anything, said Alban. It isn't getting on too well, then? Not lately. Too much else to do, I suppose. But I got a lot of jolly new words a few days ago. I'm sure Lomelinde means nightingale, for instance. And certainly Lome is night, though not darkness. The verbiage sketchy still. But he hesitated. Reticence and uneasy conscience were at war with his habit of what he called partnership with the pater, and his desire to unbosom the secret anyway. But the real difficulty is that another language is coming through as well. It seems to me to be related but quite different, much more northern. Aldo was a tree, a word I got a long time ago. In the new language it is Galad and Orn. The sun and moon seem to have similar names in both, Anar and Isel, beside Anar and Ithel. I like the first one and then the other in different moods. Valeriandic is really very attractive, but it complicates things. Good Lord, said his father, this is serious. I will respect unsolicited secrets, but do have a conscience as well as a heart and moods. or get a Latin and Greek mood. I do. I've had one for a week, and I got it now. A Latin one, luckily, and Virgil in particular. So here we part. He got up. I'm going to bed to do a bit of reading. I'll look in when I think you ought to go to bed. He closed the door on his father's snort. Okay, there's a lot in there, and that's all that one scene. That the clouds that Albin sees, the eagles of the west coming out of coming upon Numenor. That, I mean, Tolkien he's obviously in this sketching of his story, he's narrating indeed his own sense of where the stories are coming from, and he'll see the cloud formation, and it looks like eagles, and that suddenly becomes a piece of the story for him, but he doesn't know how yet, and he doesn't know what to do with it. He'll name places, dream the flavor of the languages, these sound changes, and he's trying to explain to his father this sense that he's getting these languages from somewhere else, right? It's like he's dreaming them, he's remembering them, they're coming up. He doesn't specifically say they come up out of the landscape, that races, cultures, races and cultures come with the languages, and that it's tied to the land somehow when they start talking about archaeology. And Albin's not sure that, well, if you went back into these places, like his father's joking, all you'd find were, the Ice Ages and the tooth and nail culture, and in fact, no words. That Tolkien, he's very interested in the problem of the history of the languages, but for him, they always travel with this sense of the landscape and the stories attached to them, and it's very private and personal. Now, it's perilous to psychologize on the basis of people's storytelling, but on the other hand, we do it. This desire for this intimacy with a father. I mean, Tolkien, the reason that we have his stories is, Christopher's editing all the stories, and so Tolkien has read many of these to his children. He's created this sense of you pass on stories from father to son, father to son, father to son. The stories that we have exist because there is this continuous transmission of storytelling, and it's he wants this simultaneity of process, right? That it comes from the landscape, it comes from the generation upon generation sharing the stories, it comes with the language that people are telling the stories in, which changes over time, right? He's playing that with the different name changes, that it's very personal and private, but it can be kind of, this flavoring can be inherited like facial features, but it's not it's familial rather than it's certainly not racial in the way that we mean these things now, because it's so particular and personal, right? To the shape, to the shape of your nose that you might see in your great 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 grandfather. How do we travel in time? How do we go back into the past? You can say, well, it's just by way of, you go to the site, the archaeological site, and you dig and you make up stories, and you might study the languages. Oswin's telling Albin, well, maybe you should go study your Latin and Greek. That's the practical hard stuff, and all of these other languages are a bit mystical and misty, right? That you're not going to get concrete knowledge out of Finnish and Gothic. Never mind out of these languages that seem to you to be coming to you in your imagination, and yet in Tolkien's remember, this was meant to be the time travel story. He's trying to give some real solidity to this process of transmission, so that when you are standing in the barrow as an archaeologist telling the story about the people who created this burial, you are somehow connected by way of more than just your imagination. That there's this mechanism that is as real as a spaceship. Although when Lewis wrote his space stories, right, Ransom's, it's kind of a device. He's like, it's an elevator, and he gets in the pod and he's taken to Mars, and it's not much of a it's not much of a machine, right? Tolkien wants to find a way not just to sort of lift up his characters and drop them in the past, but to give all the links, right? Now, as he says, it ultimately failed. He was never able to get all of these different pieces. I'm still just giving you the opening. What we end up with is Oswin dies, and Alban has a son, Audun, and Audun does his own exercises, writing in dreams, and we'll have to come to more to that. But the desire over and over again is this sense of being able to travel in time, and Tolkien is trying to give us a way to do that. I'm definitely going to give you a to be continued in this episode. Leaving you, I think, with the question this time is, how differently would we think about Tolkien as an author, Tolkien as a genre, the genre that he was working in, if he had been able to pull this off, if what he was telling to Christopher Brotherton, he, trying to figure out a way to anchor Strider Aragorn to his mythology and wanting to tell the story of Numenor and wanting to tell the story of Atlantis, what if by way of dreams and language and landscape and father-son storytelling between Bliss-friend and Elf-friend, he'd been able to create that time travel story that he had originally meant to write? What does that mean we think of Numenor? What does that mean we think of Middle-earth? What does it mean to be an elf friend? To be continued.